but your name, sorry, your name might appear. So if you don't want your name to appear, please rename yourself on the thing. I'm now going to turn off my video and pass the word over to Catherine. We're at the top of the hour. Catherine, please feel free to go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rob, and welcome to everybody that's joining us. And thanks again, Tom, for coming along. We are now going to have this nice fireside chat without a fire. I thought I would open the meeting really with sort of remembering a bit. When we first met, you might not remember this, but I was very much a rookie candidate, and we had a candidates weekend away. And I was so impressed with you as a young parliamentary candidate, with your email campaigning and how many people you had got. You sent out regular emails and updates. So I was impressed with you way back when. But our journeys have taken us on different paths. I mean, you were heading to Westminster and I was still then a council candidate and then heading off to the European Parliament. But we both ended up in the same place, very much pro-European. And I would like to hear from you just a little bit about your journey towards where we are today, that your stand on Europe. Perhaps you could just fill us in.
Sure, very, very happy to do that. And thank you, Catherine, for chairing our fireside chat this evening. So I was born in Melton Mowbray, so born in Leicestershire, and we moved to Derbyshire a few years later, so lived in Derbyshire. But at the age of 8, then my dad got a job in Paris, and the family up sticks, and off we went to live in the west suburbs of Paris. I should point out, for those who are tracking sort of Brexit-related things, he did actually manage to secure a job in France prior to us joining the EC and the Common and the European Union. So, but subsequently, he got a further job in Portugal, which my parents moved to in 1980. So that was as a result of us being in the European Union or the EC. So I went to school in France. I went to an international school, a school which had, it used to be the SHAPE school, so a school associated with the military in the Second World War. And the school had different sections within it. So it was a French state school, but because there were a lot of foreign students in the area, there was an English section within the school, a French, an Italian section, a Spanish section, a German section, provide teachers from their respective countries. So we had teachers coming over from the UK to teach history, language and literature, including French history, language and literature in French. So we did, and in my case, sciences, maths, physics and so on in French. So we got both a proper grounding in French and also maintained our mother tongue. And I think that was a very successful experiment. And of course, it was an environment in which I grew up with lots and lots of children from different parts of principally Europe. And subsequently I think that is what developed my sense of being a European, the sense of the connection that we have with fellow Europeans and the similar values and principles.
Very much the European school model that still goes on, but we have now lost out on. So presumably when you came back to the UK, you got interested in politics and campaigning. As I said earlier, that you really have done a lot of campaigning, of various different sorts of campaigning. Perhaps you could, rather than just sort of list what you've done, take your approach to campaigning. What are your principles behind when you're campaigning? Perhaps you could fill us in on that a little.
Sure. So I guess the thing that got me into politics and campaigning was that rather turbulent period of UK politics when Margaret Thatcher was our Prime Minister. And I felt that I needed to do something about it rather than just complaining every time she appeared on the television or a new policy came out. So that's when I got involved. And so the campaigning that I've done since then, so really since the since the 1980s has been a mixture of on the streets campaigning, very much pavement politics, campaigning on issues like the future of the local hospital, St. Helier Hospital, which I campaigned on for many years, campaigns around transport services. And so both in relation to the hospital, we had a great success in terms of St. Helier was a hospital that was built in the 1930s, and there was a succession of attempts to close it down and take away the accident and emergency unit and the maternity unit, which we successfully fought off. I then wasn't re-elected, and very soon afterwards an announcement was made that the A&E and the maternity would be going from the hospital, which I think is a great loss. We had some big successes around transport. So the trains that...
How do you approach the campaigning? I mean, how do you decide how to campaign and who to target? A little bit more around that sort of... a
little bit more detail. So with the St. Helier Hospital campaign, then clearly, for instance, using petitions to identify supporters, and then having identified who they are, then engaging with them in a series of emails or letters, updating them regularly on what's happening in relation to the campaign, organising protests as we did on the green space opposite the hospital. So and connecting with organisations in the community that were also campaigning on the same issue, but weren't politically affiliated in any way, and working hand in hand with them. We organised lots of great events around it. The one thing that I regret we didn't manage to do is we tried to get all the people in London Borough of Sutton who had classic cars to have a rally outside the hospital. That we didn't quite manage to do, but all the other initiatives, including a picnic on the park with lots of local residents who again weren't politically affiliated, but for whom this was a really big issue. So it's about really communicating with people, making sure they know that things are happening, updating them on what progress, what success there has been, and finding lots of different ways of involving people. Sometimes people don't want to go knocking door to door, but they might be happy bringing their children with a rug and having a picnic outside the hospital, displaying a protest banner. So that was the approach.
Yes, and so you and I, of course, were on the stumps during the referendum, which, you know, we have to admit that we lost that campaign. But then subsequently, you were very much involved with the People's Vote campaign. Do you want to say a little bit more about that campaign? Yes,
so that campaign was one which really started when it was a sort of combination of a Green Party initiative and Lib Dem initiative, really to push the idea within Parliament, and of course lots of activity outside by groups outside Parliament. But obviously the thing that I was involved with was the parliamentary activity, and so at the beginning of that process there were very few parties involved in supporting the People's Vote campaign. There were some individual MPs from other parties, but we managed through a series of tabling amendments and really putting pressure on particularly the Labour Party to come out in favour. As I said, a small number of individual MPs were supportive, but the party as a whole wasn't. But by applying pressure continuously, we eventually did reach a point where the discussions around the People's Vote campaign in Parliament, there were 6 or 7 different political parties involved in that, from the Labour Party, from the Lib Dems, from the Greens, from Plaid, SNP, and indeed the MPs who left at one point the Labour Party, and the MPs who left the Conservative Party with the respective groups that they set up. And that involved, as I said, parliamentary activity, but of course it also involved taking part in the People's Vote marches. And there's a very good picture on my website, tom4em.co.uk, of one of the People's March events with, I think you're in the picture as well, Catherine.
Yes, they were really good for morale. pretty exhausting, marching very slowly through London. But yes, no, we've all been there on the marches, and also I've had you into the European Parliament to meet Michel Barnier and Guy Verhofstadt and lots of others. So clearly you're a consummate campaigner. Which one stands out for you as something that was a really good campaign that hit the spot, that you would like to repeat, maybe?
Well, it's I mean, hopefully I won't have to repeat it. I mean, given that the change has happened, but I was going through Blackfriars station a couple of weeks ago on a train that went through Blackfriars, and the only reason that it local residents to get Network Rail and the Department for Transport to agree that the trains that had been running from our local area through Blackfriars and onwards were ones that could continue to run, and they changed the platform arrangement. So that was just a good example of a small, not a huge campaign, but a very successful campaign nonetheless, that meant that services could continue in that area.
It's a good feeling, isn't it, when you come past something that you campaigned for and it worked. So really good. That's nice to hear. Okay, so let's have a think about you're standing for chair of European Movement. What do you see as the role of a chair, and how would you approach this? Because I think we've got three candidates, all coming from different perspectives. How would you see the role, and how will you approach it?
Well, I think the first thing to say about the three candidates is that we are all in agreement that we want to work together, whatever the outcome. And I think each person brings something slightly different to the party, so to speak. But I guess the reason I'm standing, I would encourage people to actually look at the job description that there is for the chair, because the job description is a combination of quite a large number of different things. So it's about working with the grassroots organizations. It's about working with the media. It's about working with parliamentarians, so getting some activity in Parliament. It's about helping or setting the strategy for the European movement. And it's about the governance of a very large, very complex organization, which has, yes, 16,000 members. It has a national council with 100 and 110 or 115 members, an executive committee, and all of these things are complex sort of components that need to work together. And the experience that I've had most recently at Unlock Democracy, which is smaller in size than the European movement, but actually there are a huge number of similarities. It's a membership organization, it's a campaigning organization, it's an organization which elects a council every 2 years, like the European movement, which is responsible for the strategy. And there are those dynamics between the chair and the management board and the council and the staff and the members that need to be managed. So I think it points to experience and expertise that is very, very relevant indeed to the role of chair. And I think I can tick off everything that's on that job description.
That's good to hear. That's very good to hear. I should perhaps declare an interest that I am on the council of Unlock Democracy, of course. So I see that we won't get back into the European Union until we've sorted our own democracy out. So that's why I'm very keen to be working with Unlock Democracy to get PR. It'll be much easier for us to get back in. So you've looked at the job description and ticked off those skills that you have that you would like to do that. So thinking then of European movement, where would you like, if you're elected in the next few days, where would you like to take it in the next 2 years? Because the term of office is 2 years. So that's not much time really to set a course. What would you like to do with the European movement?
Well, it's in fact even shorter than that, because the election that is taking place now is actually a by-election. So because Andrew Adonis stood down, the new chair is elected, but only until new elections take place in October or November. So the present, whoever is elected chair on the shortly after the 20th of March, is going to have a short period of office followed by another election. So, I mean, what I'd like to achieve, let's assume a two-year timescale. I think the critical thing that is going to happen in the next 2 years is the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU is going to be renegotiated in 2025. I think that provides a massive opportunity for the European movement to seek to influence what is discussed at that as part of that review. And that could and should, in my view, include things to do with freedom of movement, for instance, because that was something that was specifically excluded from the TCA. So there's an opportunity to influence that. Now, before that, there are other sort of pressure points where the European movement should be applying pressure. Now, I'm doing this already in my role at Unlock Democracy around the Labour's National Policy Forum process. The European movement isn't yet doing this, and it should. And this is a process where the Labour Party determines its policy, and there are opportunities for outside organisations to contribute to that. Now, I think the deadline is the 17th of March. There are a certain number of questions that the Labour Party are asking people to respond to. And so there's an opportunity to make a submission to that. Now, there's no guarantee that if it gets into policy that it will necessarily then be reflected in the manifesto. But I think if it is in policy, then there's probably a better chance that it will be in the manifesto. And then, of course, there will be the manifesto process itself for all of the political parties in terms of trying to influence them in advance of the review of the TCA, to try and get the parties to commit in advance of that to push for things to happen as part of that review.
I mean, it's an opportunity to move things politically. And as you say, we all want to rejoin the EU. And I wonder how you think we might do that to bring the country with this. It's not just the politics, but it's those people in leave voting areas who don't see any of the problems as an outcome of Brexit. How do you think we can actually bring the country with us as well as the politics?
Well, there's many different things that have to happen for that to occur. So we need to grow the organisation, we need to grow the membership, because the more members we've got, then the more members we will have in areas where perhaps where there was a stronger or larger percentage of people voting for Brexit who may feel that, you know, that what we're campaigning on is something that they can't support. But if we've got more members in those areas being active, visible, pointing out some of the damage that Brexit is already causing, and on a more positive front, actually talking about some of the positives that we could have were we to negotiate new arrangements with the EU on the way to rejoin. Now, we have been helped in this respect, of course, by Rishi Sunak pointing out that Northern Ireland is now in an absolutely exceptional position of being in the most, I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but the most exciting economic zone in the world. Well, we now have a Prime Minister who is saying that, albeit Northern Ireland is not in as good a position as it was when it was part of the European Union, but is now in a better position than the rest of the UK, because the relationship with the EU has been, to a greater or lesser extent, maintained in Northern Ireland. So we need to grow the organisation, grow its influence. We need to work within Parliament, because at the moment there aren't that many people who are willing up in Parliament even to point out the damage that Brexit is causing, let alone talk about that closer relationship and putting in place the building blocks to get us back to rejoin.
Yeah, well, and some of the questions that are coming in are exactly on how do we move Labour and get people talking about it again. I mean, you're right that I don't know who wrote Sunak's speech for Northern Ireland, but the irony there that he didn't realise what he'd done and what he was saying. But as Gavin Asler, I saw, said on Twitter, it would be nice to have the Windsor Agreement cover Windsor as well and the rest of the UK. But I wonder,
Catherine, just wonder, shall I answer the question about how do we engage with Labour? Because
I think it's a big one.
I don't want to muddy the waters too much over PR, but the PR campaign within Labour, which, wearing my Unlock Democracy hat, I have been involved with, is a real sort of textbook example of how we should be putting pressure on the Labour Party on the subject of Brexit. What has happened there is there's been a concerted, methodical approach of getting constituency Labour parties to put forward motions about PR. We need exactly the same thing happening within Labour around issues to do with Brexit, to put pressure on the leadership to get them talking about it. And at the moment, I don't know whether people have listened to David Lammy talking on The Rest is Politics about Labour's foreign policy, but there was very little to say there on the subject of Brexit. So that is how we can do it. And of course, it needs to be combined with significant pressure from outside. So Labour need to see, need to hear, as do the other parties, frankly, large numbers of people, large number of constituents, people who perhaps aren't the usual suspects contacting them, who are saying this is something that they want resolved, they want to see improved relations, they want to see benefits that we had restored. So they need to feel the external pressure, but it needs to be combined with internal pressure within the Labour Party in particular.
And I have another question here from Erica. What would you say to convince them that a vote for you? Oh, sorry, that's something else. But convince people who don't see Brexit as an issue. You know, they're fed up to the back teeth with Brexit. We've done all that. It's gone, and that for me is the real hurdle that we have to get over. That it is, you know, what we're seeing is a result of Brexit. We haven't got the media on our side. Some of the businesses are now coming out, but it's that narrative. What's the issue?
Well, clearly there are, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this. There are different stories that can be told in different parts of the country. There'll be places like Bath or Bristol, perhaps, where there is less work that needs to be done about restoring the benefits that we've lost since leaving the EU. There are other parts of the country where clearly a lot more work has got to be done on that. We've got a hustings tomorrow night for the Midlands, and I think there will be a slightly different issues, and there's probably more resistance to the idea of rejoin. But even in the Midlands, there'll be significant issues around manufacturing industry. I was talking to someone about this a couple of days ago, and particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, the impact for them, if they were a business exporting to the EU, has been astonishing. I was talking to a business that is just down the road from where I live, who do import-export of parts to the EU, and they have had to recruit 3 extra people just to deal with the new paperwork that they're required to fill in to be able to import and export things to the EU, which they didn't have to employ these people before. So in certain parts of the country, that is the sort of message that may have more resonance and may get around people's resistance to talking about the issue. And I suppose there will be a recognition, and I think even the media are picking up on this, that some of the problems that people are having in terms of supply of fruit and veg, or indeed the cost of fruit and veg, there is unfortunately a connection with Brexit. I mean, either it's to do with why would you want to export your goods from Europe if there's a shortage of supply? Why choose the difficult route to the UK when you can in fact get to France, Italy, or Germany without any problems in terms of paperwork? So I think there are those stories that I think people are starting to feel are impacting them, and they may not make the direct connection, but I think we can and should do that in terms of the material and the messages that we are putting out.
Just you're absolutely right about the difficulty of moving across, and I don't know that the Windsor Agreement is going to be any easier. It'll be easier for the bigger guys, the Marks and Spencers and the Sainsbury's, but the smaller businesses where the truckloads have got different things inside them is going to be difficult, even going through the red line. But one group of people who really have been impacted, and I think we all, those of us of a certain age who have taken advantage of the freedom of travel, of movement, of just traveling around Europe, going to Erasmus and all the other benefits of being inside the European Union, those who have lost out, of course, are young people. And I think I wonder how, I don't know what the demographic is of the European movement membership, but I wonder how you would approach reaching out to young people and encouraging them to join the European movement, to campaign on your behalf locally.
Well, during the in the run up to the referendum and immediately afterwards, and in the run up to the People's Vote, or whilst the People's Vote campaign was underway, I did an awful lot of going around the country talking to student groups in universities, and clearly there was a very strong appetite for staying in the EU, a strong appetite for the People's Vote, and that was because of the recognition that rights, and I do think they're rights that I had, you had, to live, work, love, study, retire anywhere in the EU, are rights that have now been taken away. So I believe there is still that intensity. I'm talking to European movement, young European movement members in the next couple of days. There is that intensity of feelings about what happened, and I guess it's about engaging, finding the campaigns that are relevant. So Erasmus being the clearest one. And one of the good things about the UK and the way that we have devolved responsibilities is that we can point to successes in other parts of the United Kingdom. So Wales have invested, I think it's £65 million in bringing back an Erasmus scheme. So we can actually point to, it's perfectly possible for this to happen. Look, it's happening in Wales, to add pressure on the Westminster government.
Yes, and I see them as a real a force that we should be harnessing, because as you say, it's such a loss for them. Right, now let's see what other questions have been coming in. Yes, we're going back to, oh, now this is a lovely one. Okay, I think we probably could cover this quite quickly. Why do you want to rejoin the EU? What does EU mean to you, and what links do you have with the EU? So I think we've covered some of it, but that why, because I think that's what we would get if we knocked on the door. Why should we go back in? Have you got a succinct answer for that, Tom?
Well, I want to go back in. I want us to be part of the European Union, because we are we're a European nation, because the values which the UK subscribes to in terms of human rights, civil rights, international law, are ones that are replicated in the European Union. I feel much closer to other Europeans than I might do, for instance, US citizens. And I'll give you, I mean, I like Americans, but I'll give you an example of something that happened when I was at school. I had a friend, so this was when I was at school in France, a friend who was American, went back to America, came back a few years later, and in the first sort of conversation I had with him, he asked me, well, I think we must have been about 17 at the time. He asked me, what car have you got? And his second question was, what gun have you got? Now, no one should draw any conclusions from anecdotal evidence based on one experience, but I feel closer to Europeans than the US. And I think what has happened in politics in the UK is that there are a group of people who feel closer to the Americans, and I would put a lot of conservatives in that category, certainly conservative politicians. And there are another group who feel that our relationship and our history and our culture is closer to that of Europeans. And certainly I feel that I'm in that category. And that was a very long answer, I'm afraid, Catherine, not a sentence.
That's all right, but I want to get all the questions in, so we're doing fine for time. I have a question here from Michael Phillips, who says, I've lived in Spain for nearly 18 years, lived in Italy for 3 years when posted to NATO, and he's a board member of Remain in Spain, a group I know very well and I worked with when I was in the European Parliament, and he's a member of ELDEG. If you become the European Movement's chair, how will you help us and how can we help you? So there are many groups across Europe who are like Remain in Spain, still active, still want to do, and there are citizens in the UK who are still campaigning that do so much wonderful work here. How do you think European Movement can be working with these other groups?
Well, I can give Michael one very concrete example, and that is trying to something that I'm already doing through Unlock Democracy, which is try to improve the representation of people like him, so UK citizens living in the EU, by ensuring that they have members of parliament who are in effect representing UK citizens who live in Spain, as opposed to Michael, if he is indeed on the register in the UK, having to register with a member of parliament who he might have had a connection with that constituency 15 or 20 years ago. And I think what this would do, it would create a body of MPs in parliament who would have a much, much better understanding of the implications of, for instance, Brexit for UK citizens living in the EU. And I think that would lead them to being much more proactive in actually pressing for restoring or addressing some of the big challenges that UK citizens living in the EU now face, things to do with, for instance, people who work in or what need to work in different countries within the EU, things to do with the 90-day rule for people coming from the UK to an EU country. And I think having MPs who'd be willing to advocate that rather than, you know, the UK citizen being one of 70,000 in a local electorate, I think is just a very concrete example of how people in Remain and the similar organisations in France, Italy, and so on would, I think, have their voices heard much more effectively. And I suppose the final thing to say is that the European Movement needs to do more on the partnership work front. I think there's been, certainly in the discussions, the hustings that we've had, there have been opportunities in the past to work with other organisations in the UK, for instance, Best for Britain, that perhaps haven't been pursued. And certainly the approach I've adopted in my current role is one of partnership and working with any organisation that I think is interested in the issues that I want to campaign on. And clearly Remain would be one of those organisations.
There's a question here from Avril about pointing out that the Brexit and the UKIP vote was very much a fear of foreigners. And today we've heard even more draconian suggestions on what to do with people arriving by boat. So I wonder how you think about how the European Movement can work with groups other than the the demographic that we already have. I think our membership is quite elderly. We touched on young people, but there are plenty of other groups that we should be working with to challenge this racist idea that we should shut the door and pull up the drawbridge. So perhaps you can have a thought about that.
Yes, I mean, you're right, Catherine, that the European movement to grow and also to reach this critical mass that we've set for ourselves of having consistent support by 2/3 or more of the country for rejoin, that we will not achieve that if we do not reach out far beyond the present membership and supporter base of the European movement. That is clear. So that, as I said earlier, is partly about growing the organization and raising its profile. At the moment, the profile of the European movement is not what it should be. So, for instance, we've got an election taking place for the chair of the European movement, and there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's been no coverage of that in the press at all. So we've got to do something about the profile, because if we're successful at putting across a message that is conciliatory, one thing that I never did during the Brexit campaign was accuse anyone of being ignorant, or I take that back. I did accuse Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg of being ignorant, but for the people who voted to leave, they did so for a variety of reasons, and often it wasn't immigration. I think sometimes it was local issues such as perhaps a lack of housing and a lack of school places. But there are things that can be done to address those, to reduce concerns that people might have. You're never going to win everyone over, but we need to achieve that 66%, two-thirds sort of majority. So we're not going to get everyone on board, but I think we can address people's concerns. And often that concern, I think the concern that was raised during the Brexit referendum was partly linked to something that was happening internationally at the time, which was Syria. And every day there were pictures of literally millions of people walking across Eastern Europe and on eventually a lot of them to Germany. And that is the backdrop against which this campaign was being run. And we're not in that position now. So I think that factor, or at least we're not on that scale, that factor is not quite as prevalent as it was 6 or 7 years ago.
I think, Tom, on your point about ignorance, I think one thing that always struck me as a member of the European Parliament was how ignorant members of the UK Parliament were about how Europe worked. And it broke my heart that all MPs were allowed 2 trips to the European Parliament every year. Hardly anybody came, and certainly none of the Conservatives came. Had they seen that, then they would have known. And I think your point earlier about Rishi Sunak, what he said in Northern Ireland just recently, just flagged up how ignorant he was. He's championing now what Northern Ireland has. So I take it, I think we can call some of them ignorant, certainly ignorant of the facts, but not the voters, because they were lied to, and we know that. Let's move on then to another question I've got here about medicines and the supply of medicines. Now I've lost it now. It's on the screen. It was there on the screen a minute ago, and I've lost it because they're scrolling in so fast. But I know.
Sorry, just on that, it might have been a question about the Windsor framework, because that has dealt with the issue that there was in Northern Ireland around new medicines. So that. Yeah. I'm pleased to say has been resolved.
Yes, well, yes, but the supply of medicines generally, but also qualifications and recognition of qualifications is putting a real strain on the NHS, getting machines repaired, instruments that are used in theatre, for operations, have to go back, and the laboratories that actually clean them, they're not cleaned in hospital, they're in Germany. All of these build in delays. So I think, you know, I think the effect on the NHS is going to get greater and greater. It's creaking, as we know. But I think that is another aspect that's something that we should be concentrating on.
Well, indeed. And of course, that is exactly the sort of thing that when the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement happens, that could be worked into those discussions. So what I think the European movement should be doing in advance of that is, first of all, talking to other organizations that are very actively involved in looking at the TCA, so organizations like Best for Britain, but putting pressure on the governments to ensure that there is a proper consultation. Now, one of the things that happened with Brexit is that the government promised that there would be better consultation around trade deals than there was previously when those trade deals were struck by the EU. That didn't happen at all. And there was often no consultation at all. So we need to try to force that on government so that individual measures can be put forward and debated by Parliament, and Parliament can express a view on those measures. And we also have the opportunity through the UK EU Parliamentary Assembly, which is the body that sort of discusses these things. We have an opportunity to put pressure on them as well, to try to get them to take these issues on board. So there are a number of pressure points where we can apply pressure to try to get some of these issues resolved. And as we get the issues resolved, then rejoining, of course, becomes that much easier because we end up being closer, particularly if we've managed to stop the government doing things like destroying 3,000 or 4,000 pieces of legislation, the bonfire, so-called bonfire of the regulations, which would then make it much harder because the divergence with the EU would have grown significantly were the government to push ahead with that.
Absolutely. And we hear today that neonicotinoids, I can never say this word, but I campaigned hard in the European Parliament, but they're now being allowed in the UK, but they are not being allowed in the European Union because the ECJ managed to uphold the Parliament's decision. So yes, it is that. And who knows what will happen if we go too far down that line, that they now say that food stuff grown with these chemicals will not now be allowed into the European Union. So the further we get, the harder everything gets. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so I'm going to push on. But this actually touches on what we have just been talking about. Sarah says, how can we get more pro-EU voices on the BBC and other mainstream media? And I wonder, in your role as chair, how you might approach that, whether it's your job or whether it's, you know, how would you direct the whole of the organisation? Because you can't be on every BBC platform all the time.
No, and nor would I want to be, because if we're trying to promote the European movement to a much wider audience, then we need to have spokespeople from lots of different ages and different groups. So it would not be helpful for it to be me. So we are fortunate in having some high-profile people involved with the European movement anyway. So there are lots of opportunities for other people to speak out. But I think the most effective thing that we can do is to identify local advocates and people who can advocate perhaps on their local radio station, their local TV station, through the letters pages of their local newspaper. And that is a much easier way to get the European movement's message across than it is to try to secure a hit in a small column or a small quote in one of the national newspapers, or 30 seconds on a national TV channel. So we've got to be smarter, I think, and involve a wide range of people. And to do that, we've got to provide people with the materials to do it. So a lot more use of the European Movements database, for instance, to encourage people to write to their local paper about, how come half of the shelves in my supermarket haven't got fruit and veg on, and then a quote from a haulier who says, well, I'm sorry, but that, I haven't been asked to truck that in because it's gone to France or Spain or Germany because it's easier, and there's less paperwork to fill in.
Yes, absolutely. So that's very good. There was a question here. Be very quick about this because I've got 3 or 4 that I want to wind up with. But do you think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has helped Leavers to reconsider their choice?
I hope so, because of course, going back to the foundation of the EC and the European Union, common market, and so on, it was on the basis of bringing together countries that had been at war to ensure that they didn't go to war again. Well, it's been successful for countries in the EU, and the fact is that the EU has to cooperate. And the UK is now cooperating with the EU. I mean, there's a conference, UK-France conference coming up, where security issues will be prominent. So we need to have that. We need to be aware of the security risks of the UK going it alone. We're now in a global environment where you have the US, you have China. To a certain extent, you have Russia, and the UK by itself is quite vulnerable and needs to be more, I think, more integrated with the rest of the Europe on when it comes to security issues.
I think viewers won't have missed maybe that I'm wearing a Ukrainian ribbon here. My son lives in Kiev and is currently back there at the moment. And I think the pro-European stance of the Ukrainians who are before the war looking to join the European Union, they have visa-free travel, which is more than we have. They have a better trade agreement, which is better than we have currently. I can see that the focus of the European Union, now that we have left, is shifting. So it is going to be a very complicated thing, but it has given us the opportunity to, as you say, remind people that the European Union is there for peace. And that NATO is a bit stronger than it was a few months ago now, but we can't always rely on the Americans to keep us out of trouble. Look, we're coming to our last few minutes. I want to ask you, you have explained earlier that we have, and you probably have, whoever wins this competition or this election until November. So what would be your first job? Okay, you've won the election. What's your first job? I've got to get something done before November.
Well, the critical first task for the new chair will be to be involved in the appointment of the successor to Anna Bird. So our chief executive is moving on. So there'll be a period where the chair will have, I suspect, substantial responsibilities. Perhaps if there's a gap between the departure, Anna hasn't left yet, but will be departing. If there's a gap between her departing and the new CEO being appointed, then there'll be a critical role there, I think, for the chair to support that new person, and possibly, if there is a time lag between Anna's departure and their appointment, actually being actively involved in the organization. Now, I know how important it is that relationship, particularly pending the arrival of a CEO is a positive one, where the staff are the European movement can continue their activities without sort of multiple interventions from the chair or anybody else trying to pull them in different directions. So I know about that and would be very careful to ensure that during that interim period that the organisation continued to operate. And there are just perhaps some practical things that need to be done in terms of it may be that I'm going to get a bit technical here, I'm afraid, but the database arrangements, which are critical to keeping members informed about what is happening, are not quite working as well as they could. And I don't know whether it will be necessary to change that completely. But one of the things that I did at Unlock Democracy was change the campaign system that we had and replace it with something that has proven to be far, far, far more effective in terms of the way we can communicate with members, the way we can get them involved, our ability to see who is responding to things, generating information about what is proving successful from an income point of view. And so there may be some quite practical things that need to happen, really just to make sure the organization is ticking over until a new CEO is in place.
It's a big job. You've got a full-time day job. I think all of you have got day jobs. So I wonder how you feel you can divide up your time to make sure, because as you say, you have an executive and then you have this very large council, which seems to me an extraordinary number of people involved, which is good that they're involved, but as chair, you have to manage that. How would you approach that?
Well, as I think I said at the beginning, the good news is that all three candidates have said that they would want to be involved after the election, even if they're not successful. Yeah. So potentially there are roles that whoever is, all three of us might want to take up. So I think the new chair is going to be able to share their workload with others. I'm also in the fortunate position where at Unlock Democracy, I think the organisation is in a very strong position. And I think, Catherine, you're one of the people who I've been negotiating with, but I think I can successfully negotiate spending less time there and freeing up more time to work for the European movement or to chair the European movement. And of course, as a previously or former member of Parliament for 22 years, that was very much a 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, nearly job. So I'm used to working long hours, and as long as I enjoy it, which I'm sure I would, then I'm willing to put in the effort. And I wouldn't have put myself forward if I didn't think that I could do the job. Okay, well, that's good to hear. And yes, I with my other hat on, I can see that's very sensible. What I'm now going to say the one more question. I do apologise that lots of questions have come in, and I've run some of them into each other. So if I haven't actually asked your question, I hope your queries have been covered while we've been talking. But this one I like. What would you say to convince members that a vote for you is very well placed? Hopefully, the members who've been on this call will know the answer to that question. So what the European movement needs is a chair with skills and expertise in a range of different areas, who's a committed European and committed to rejoin. The skills that I've got, whether it's in campaigning, whether it's on the media, I got the front page of The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, and I'm hoping we'll get it again in a few weeks. The skills that I've got working cross-party, because yes, we need the campaigning, we need the grassroots activity, but unless we've got parliamentary support, we're not going anywhere. And the skills around the chairing of a very complex organisation, the governance issues around that, These are all things that I've done recently and done successfully. So that is why I would want people to vote for me, and I think they can do it with confidence that I will be up to the job.
That's really good. Now, is there anything you wanted other than that? I mean, you've rounded that off really nicely, and I'm looking to see if there was a sort of off the wall job, off the wall question here, but I haven't. But somebody has asked, how do we vote? Now, do you want to fill them in on the voting procedure?
Absolutely. So the voting procedure, it's a electronic ballot, and people will have received an email by now. And certainly if your ballot ended up where my ballot ended up, mine ended up in spam. So you need to check your spam folder. Yours, Catherine, ended up in the right place, didn't it? In the inbox.
Yes, mine was fine.
For some people, you will find it in your spam. So it went out at 12 today, or maybe 1 minute past 12. So you should be able to find it just looking at the time, in effect, the time stamp on it. And then what you have to do, it's an AV vote, so alternative vote. And some people have said, well, why isn't it STV? Well, the answer is because you can't have an STV election when you're only electing one for one post. You have to have an alternative vote election. And what you are required to do, or at least that is what the form suggests, and I think this is correct, is that you are required to choose your first, second, and third preference.
Yeah.
Now, that is something that I have in an earlier meeting taken up, because you shouldn't really be forced to do that. If you want to choose just one, and then 1 and 2, then you can do that. You should be able to do that. But the way the system is set up, you can't do that. So you have to choose your first, second, and third preference. And the person you put at the top of the list is your preferred candidate, and you use little arrows to move people up and down depending on where you want them to be, your first, second, or third preference. And obviously I hope that people on this call will want to put me first.
I hope so too. I've got a question from Sarah. She's in France. Can she vote for you as long as she's a member? I would assume she can, because the email will get to France as easily. But I do have a question. If you don't have email, are there paper ballots going out? Do you know?
Now, I'm afraid I don't know, as I was answering, it's electronic. I don't know the answer to that question. So I don't know whether anyone else on the call actually knows the answer to that question. But I will find out, and we will put something out on social media just to confirm that. I would hope, of course, that there would be a paper ballot option, because there will be a number of EM members who I suspect won't be on email.
Yeah.
But I'll confirm that and put that out on social media. Okay,
that's really good. So we've covered voting, we've covered who to vote for. Of course, that's for Tom. I hope if you have not been decided up till now, that what you have heard tonight will convince you that Tom is very well qualified to be your next chair of the European movement. So I think I would just wind up now, because we're nearly at the top of the hour, unless you've got anything else you want to add, Tom.
The only thing I want to add is a thank you to you, Catherine, and to Rob for organising tonight, and for everyone who attended, and our apologies if all the questions weren't answered, but hopefully a significant percentage of them were.
Well, I hope so too. And thank you, Tom, for what you're doing. Thank you for standing. It's never easy to stand for election, but I think we must congratulate all three of the candidates. But I think it's been a real joy tonight to hear you and your vision for the European movement. And I think, as I said, and you have explained, you're very well qualified to do that job. Thank you again. And Paul has joined us here that we are now winding up. You will be able to catch up if you joined us late. You'll be able to see this on YouTube, and Paul will fill us in on that. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to interview tonight. I'm now going to tell you this is the first time I've ever done this. So it was an experience for me as well. So thank you very much, all of you, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Bye-bye.